Madyson, Maddy, Middleton. On the evening of July 27, 2015, a Santa Cruz police officer stood inside a dim concrete garage beneath an apartment complex known for its art studios and close-knit community. And by that point, the search had already stretched into its second exhausting day, with volunteers scouring riverbanks and wooded trails, neighbors knocking on doors, and nearly 50 FBI agents moving from apartment to apartment, all of them convinced that an 8-year-old girl had somehow wandered beyond the safety of her home. But she had not wandered anywhere. The answer had been sitting in that very building the entire time. Inside a recycling bin, concealed in a way no one had first noticed, officers discovered what no parent should ever have to hear. And in that moment the search for Madyson, Maddy, Middleton ended only to become something that would fracture a community that had believed it was safe. And what began as a missing child case in a quiet Santa Cruz community shifted suddenly into a case that would test the limits of the juvenile justice system, ignite public outrage, and eventually reshape the way California prosecuted violent crimes committed by teenagers. But to understand what really happened, we have to go back to the afternoon when Maddy was last seen alive, riding her scooter in a place everyone believed was secure. But before we continue, I want to thank you, my amazing viewers and subscribers, for your support through your likes, shares, and comments. Your engagements help make these stories more meaningful. If you're new here, be sure to hit that subscribe button and join our growing community of true crime enthusiasts. Now let's get started, shall we? Santa Cruz had always carried the reputation of being relaxed and creative, a coastal city where art studios sat beside family apartments, and where neighbors recognized one another by name. And inside the Tannery Arts Center, that sense of familiarity was even stronger, because the complex had been designed as affordable housing for artists and working families, which meant children ran freely through the courtyard while parents talked nearby, and residents passed each other daily on staircases and balconies without hesitation or suspicion. The buildings surrounded a central open space, and the first-floor garage connected everything together, and it was common to see kids riding scooters across the pavement while adults unloaded groceries or walked toward rehearsal rooms. So the atmosphere did not feel guarded or tense, but ordinary and communal. And that routine sense of safety would later become one of the most painful parts of the story. Madyson, Maddy, Middleton had grown up inside that environment, and she moved through it with confidence because she knew the faces around her and they knew hers. And she had been born on October 5, 2006, an only child whose energy filled whatever space she entered, and her grandfather, Dan Middleton, often called her Chatty Maddy because she talked easily and asked questions and told stories as if she were already narrating her own little world. She loved wolves and drew them repeatedly, and she painted toy animals and wrote small plays, and she danced and sang without embarrassment. And when she rode her white razor scooter across the courtyard, she did it with the kind of focus that children have when they believe the world around them is steady and secure. Her mother, Laura Jordan, watched her closely but not fearfully, and her father, Michael Middleton, shared that trust in the community. So on Sunday, July 26, 2015, the afternoon unfolded the way countless summer afternoons had unfolded before it at the Tannery Arts Center, and around 4 p.m., neighbors saw Maddy riding her white razor scooter across the courtyard. And sometime around 5:07 p.m., surveillance cameras captured her near the mailboxes on the ground level, which would later become the last confirmed sighting of her alive. And as the minutes passed, Laura Jordan began looking for her daughter, because Maddy was not answering when called and was not visible where she had been riding earlier. Laura checked the usual places, scanning the courtyard and glancing toward the entrances, assuming at first that Maddy had gone to a friend's apartment or drifted slightly out of view. She searched the courtyard first, walking through it quickly and calling her name. And when she did not see her, she moved door to door, knocking on neighbors' apartments and asking if anyone had seen her daughter. and by 6:08 p.m., Laura called 911, and she reported that her 8-year-old daughter was missing from the apartment complex. And what began as a mother's search shifted instantly into a police response. Santa Cruz police officers arrived quickly, and they began canvassing the area while asking residents for details about when and where Maddie had last been seen. And the search expanded almost immediately beyond the courtyard, because even though there was no confirmed evidence that she had left the property, the possibility that she had wandered further had to be considered. Sheriff search and rescue teams were activated, and K-9 units began tracking through pathways and along the nearby San Lorenzo River, and volunteers from the community joined in, spreading out in organized groups, checking trails and underbrush and parking lots, because every minute mattered, and no one wanted to assume the worst. The search radius widened to roughly 4.5 miles, and tips began pouring in, eventually reaching more than 1,000, and law enforcement processed each one methodically, trying to determine whether there was any sign that Maddie had been taken or had simply gotten lost. At a press briefing, police stated clearly, "We're looking for a lost child." And that language mattered, because at that stage, investigators had no confirmed evidence of an abduction, and without clear proof of kidnapping, the strict criteria for issuing an Amber Alert were not met, so one was not issued. And as darkness fell, the search extended beyond the complex and into surrounding areas, including riverbanks and homeless camps, because officers had to eliminate every possibility, and neighbors walked with flashlights and called her name. Then Monday morning came, and nearly 50 FBI agents joined the effort, moving door to door through the apartment complex, interviewing residents and checking apartments. And the scale of the search signaled that this was no longer a routine missing child case, but something far more urgent. However, while volunteers searched miles away and helicopters scanned open spaces and officers worked outward from the complex, one critical assumption remained unchallenged: that Maddie had left the building. And yet, as the hours stretched into a second day and hope began to thin, the truth was far closer than anyone imagined. Because while the search expanded outward in every direction, the answer had never moved at all. It was upstairs. By the evening of July 27th, the search had been running for nearly 2 full days. But late that evening, investigators turned back to the building again. At about 7:55 p.m., police conducted another search of the garage area beneath the apartments, and this was not the first time officers had been there, which made what happened next even harder to process, because the item they were looking at was not lying out in plain view, and it did not immediately stand out as something connected to a missing child case. Inside a recycling bin, officers found a bag. It had been concealed in a way that was not obvious during earlier checks, and when they examined it more closely, the search ended in the worst possible way. Maddie had been found inside the same apartment complex where she lived, in the same place neighbors had been walking past while calling her name. And in that moment, the entire case changed, because what had been treated as a missing child search became a homicide investigation inside a community that had believed the danger was somewhere outside its walls. The news moved through the complex quickly, and the emotional collapse was immediate, because families who had spent the last 2 days searching riverbanks and trails now had to absorb the fact that she had never left the building at all. And that realization carried its own kind of shock, since it meant the person responsible was likely someone close, someone local, someone who had watched the same search unfold. At a press conference the next day, Santa Cruz Police Chief Kevin Vogel explained that Maddie's body had been found in a non-obvious manner, and that detail mattered because it helped explain why the search had taken so long, despite the heavy police presence, the volunteer turnout, and the repeated checks around the property. Vogel also revealed something that pushed the case into a new and deeply unsettling direction, because he said a suspect had been nearby during the search activity, and that suspect was a teenage boy who lived in the same complex. which meant officers were no longer looking at a stranger passing through the area, but at someone inside the community itself. And as Santa Cruz tried to process what police were now saying, one image became impossible to shake, because while officers and volunteers searched the complex and the surrounding area for an 8-year-old child, the boy who lived upstairs had been watching it all unfold. Adrian Jerry, A.J. Gonzalez, had lived in the same building as Maddy for years. He wasn't a stranger to her or her family. In fact, he had been a part of their everyday surroundings, just like so many others in the apartment complex. He was a 15-year-old teenager, known for his calm demeanor, a love for yo-yo tricks, and his ability to play the piano. He seemed harmless enough, blending into the background of the tight-knit community. But it all started with a simple promise: ice cream. That was what Adrian told her when he lured her into his apartment, a tactic as old as childhood itself, an innocent offer that would soon lead to a nightmare. Maddy trusted him, and that trust would cost her her life. After she was reported missing, police quickly turned their focus to Adrian, and it didn't take long for them to bring him in. The officers questioned him overnight, and during that time, the truth began to unravel. When they pressed him, Adrian confessed to what had happened, and the details he revealed were chilling. He admitted that he had lured Maddy inside, that he had assaulted her, and then, when she was still alive, he had taken her life in his own apartment. Afterward, he disposed of her body in the same recycling bin where it would be found hours later. But it didn't stop there. Adrian's behavior after the crime added another layer of complexity to the story. In the days that followed, he inserted himself into the search efforts, asking neighbors what had happened and showing up to observe the police as they combed through the area. It was almost as if he couldn't help himself, needing to be part of the investigation, to witness the consequences of his actions without being caught. Katie Carroll, one of Adrian's former friends, described him as introverted, someone who had always kept to himself. But behind his quiet demeanor, there were signs of turmoil. She spoke about how he had often talked about self-harm, about his depression, and the cryptic posts he'd made on social media, all of which painted a picture of someone who had been struggling for a long time. Just hours after Maddy's body was discovered, Adrian had posted a video of himself playing Mad World on his keyboard. But even with all of this, no one saw it coming. No one expected the boy who had lived so close, who had shared spaces with Maddy and her family, to be the one who would turn their world upside down. On July 30th, 2015, Adrian Jerry A.J. Gonzalez stood in a courtroom with his hands shackled in front of him. At just 15 years old, he was facing adult charges: murder, kidnapping, rape, and lewd acts with a child under 14. These were not accusations to be taken lightly. District Attorney Jeffrey Roselle stood firm, his voice clear as he addressed the courtroom, stating, "We are confident in the jurors of Santa Cruz." His words reflected the belief that justice would be served, that the truth would come to light, and that Adrian, despite his age, would face the full consequences of his actions. On the other side of the courtroom, Public Defender Larry Bigham offered a very different perspective. He didn't deny the severity of the charges, but he framed his defense with a different focus. "Our job is to ensure he receives a fair trial," Bigham said. His words weren't just a legal statement, they were a reminder that the system, while tough, was designed to ensure that even those accused of the most heinous crimes had the right to due process. Then, in 2017, the transfer hearing to determine whether Adrian would be tried as an adult or a juvenile was held, and Judge Timothy Salazar made his ruling. Adult court was the appropriate venue. The decision shocked many, especially those who had hoped Adrian's age might lead to a more lenient outcome. But Judge Salazar's reasoning was clear. He cited Adrian's sophistication, the gravity of the crime, and the limited time for rehabilitation in juvenile court. For him, this wasn't just a case of youthful immaturity, it was a deliberate and calculated act, one that demanded a more serious legal response. Bail was set at a staggering $5 million, a figure that reflected the seriousness with which the court viewed the charges against him. Then, just as the case seemed to be following a predictable path, everything changed. In 2019, a new law passed in California that would change everything for Adrian Gonzalez. Senate Bill 1391 was introduced, and it prohibited the prosecution of 14- and 15-year-olds as adults. It was a law that had been built on the belief that young people, especially those still in their teens, had the potential to rehabilitate and deserve a chance to be treated in a juvenile system that could focus on reform rather than punishment. For Adrian, this law shifted the course of his entire case. What had once seemed like a straightforward path to adult prison now suddenly faced the possibility of being rerouted to juvenile detention, and the court would have to reassess how to deal with a young offender who had committed a crime so horrific. As soon as SB 1391 passed, Adrian's case was transferred back to juvenile court, and the ripple effects were immediate. The public reaction was swift and intense. Many felt that a crime like this, one involving such a brutal and calculated act, shouldn't be treated lightly, and there was a growing sense of outrage. Prosecutors, whose job it was to ensure justice was served, called it a travesty of justice, arguing that Adrian's crime was so severe that he should not be shielded by a juvenile system simply because of his age. The debates over juvenile justice became louder as people questioned whether laws designed to protect young offenders were, in some cases, enabling criminals to evade appropriate consequences for their actions. But while the public's opinion raged, the law had been made, and Adrian's fate was now tied to a system that was set up to focus on rehabilitation rather than punishment. The California Supreme Court upheld the law in 2021, solidifying SB 1391 as a key pillar in juvenile justice reform, and the entire legal framework that had once seemed so clear began to feel a lot more murky. Then, in April 2021, Adrian Gonzalez stood in front of the judge and, after years of legal battles, finally entered a guilty plea to 6 felony counts, including murder, kidnapping, and sexual assault. His plea brought a sense of closure to the prosecution's case, but it left many questions still hanging in the air. Questions about the path forward, about redemption, and about the kind of person Adrian might become after he served his time. The sentence was handed down swiftly. Adrian would spend the next 10 years in juvenile detention, with his release set for his 25th birthday. After that, he would face a future that was uncertain but bound by the strict conditions of his sentence. He would have to register as a sex offender for the rest of his life, and on top of that, he was ordered to pay $22,000 in restitution to Maddy's family, though no amount of money could ever truly heal the damage he had done. For Maddy's mother, Laura, the sentence brought no comfort. She had spent years trying to hold her family together, but the loss of her daughter, coupled with the events surrounding Adrian's crime, left her emotionally shattered. She struggled with PTSD, depression, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness, unable to return to work or find peace. Her husband, Michael, stood by her side through it all, but his response was different. He didn't express anger in the way many might have expected. "Forgiveness is the only path," he said quietly, as if trying to convince himself more than anyone else. It was a sentiment that came from a place of hurt, but also from a desire for something better, something that might offer some sense of peace in the aftermath of unimaginable loss. Adrian himself, standing there in front of the court, gave a statement of his own. He said that he would work on his issues, that he would seek help for the problems that had led him down this dark path, and he apologized for what he had done. He expressed hope that one day, somewhere down the line, forgiveness might come to him. Some in the courtroom listened and believed him, perhaps wanting to believe that a young man who had committed such horrific acts could be capable of redemption, of change. But for others, the words felt hollow, like an apology that couldn't possibly undo the damage, like an expression of regret that couldn't bring Maddy back. Then, in October of 2024, Adrian Gonzalez turned 25. For most people, turning 25 might feel like a milestone, a moment where adulthood truly begins. But for Adrian, it meant that he was eligible for release. However, before that, in July 2024, a probable cause hearing was held to determine whether Adrian still posed a danger to the community. Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Ashley Mowry was called to testify. She had interviewed Adrian and examined his psychological history, and she made a striking statement in front of the court. She said that his crime had been sexually motivated and that his behavior had been driven by deeper psychological issues. She recommended that Adrian undergo treatment if he was ever to be released, believing that his past actions were linked to unresolved mental health struggles. Prosecutor Tara George wasted no time in making her case. She painted a grim picture of Adrian, describing him as someone who lacked empathy and who had been manipulative in the way he presented himself, both to those around him and to the authorities. She referenced Adrian's neurodevelopmental issues, explaining that his brain, still maturing at the time of the crime, had not fully developed in ways that would allow him to grasp the full consequences of his actions. For her, there was no doubt, Adrian was dangerous, and releasing him would put the community at risk. On the other side, defense attorney Charlie Stevens argued passionately for Adrian's release. He acknowledged the gravity of the crime, but stressed that Adrian's brain development was still ongoing, a fact that was often overlooked in cases involving young offenders. Stevens made the case that Adrian had not planned the crime, but that it had been a spontaneous, impulsive act, driven by the immaturity of a 15-year-old mind. He pointed to the progress Adrian had made during his time in juvenile detention, highlighting the therapy and counseling sessions that had helped him confront his issues. According to Stevens, Adrian had changed, and while his past actions were horrific, they didn't define who he was today. The question before the jury was clear yet impossibly difficult. Was there reasonable doubt that Adrian was still a danger to society? Could he truly be rehabilitated? Or would his past actions always be a shadow over his future? The jury deliberated, and in February 2025, the decision came down. Adrian's request for release was denied. The jury, though divided on some aspects, concluded that he was still a threat, that the risk of him reoffending was too great to let him go free just yet. However, this wasn't the end of his case. The legal framework that surrounded Adrian's release allowed for 2-year extensions, which meant that the decision could be revisited in the future. Every 2 years, the question of his release would be raised again, and each time, the legal system would have to weigh whether Adrian had truly changed, or whether he was still the same person who had taken Maddy's life all those years ago. In the wake of Maddy's death, the community of Santa Cruz found itself grappling with a kind of grief that left no one untouched. Vigils were held, small gatherings of people lighting candles and offering prayers for a child whose life had been stolen far too soon. The city's flags flew at half-staff, a somber sign of collective mourning that echoed through every corner of the town, from the streets to the schools to the homes where people who once felt safe now carried a new, painful awareness of the darkness that could lurk even in the most familiar places. The community rallied together under the banner of remembrance. A movement called Howl for Maddy was born, with people gathering to remember her not just as a victim, but as the lively, vibrant little girl she had been. The howl, a tribute to her love for wolves, became a symbol of the wild spirit she had carried with her, a reminder of what had been lost. And as a lasting memorial, a wolf sculpture was placed in the center of Santa Cruz, a tangible representation of her, her memory now forever etched into the heart of the city. But even as these tributes were made, there were moments of unimaginable pain and betrayal. Maddy's father, Michael, had kept her ashes close, trying to hold on to the last piece of his daughter. But one cruel act added even more weight to an already heavy burden. His car was broken into, and the ashes, her ashes, were stolen, never to be recovered. It was as if the tragedy of losing her was being compounded by one final act of violation, and the emotional toll it took on Michael was unbearable. Then, in a moment that still resonates with so many, Laura Jordan, Maddy's mother, did something unexpected. Despite the unimaginable loss, she chose to publicly support the suspect's mother, Reggie Gonzalez. In a time when anger and hatred could have easily consumed her, Laura reached out in empathy, understanding the pain that Reggie must also be experiencing, even though their experiences were so drastically different. Two grieving mothers, each broken in her own way, yet somehow connected by the shared weight of loss. It was a quiet, powerful moment of humanity in the midst of tragedy. And yet, for all the healing that the community tried to foster, for all the memorials and the coming together, Santa Cruz was never the same. The town that had once been a safe haven for families, where children played freely and neighbors trusted one another, now carried an invisible scar. The trust that had been so easily taken for granted was forever shattered. Santa Cruz, a place known for its arts and beauty, had become a town forever marked by the loss of one bright, beautiful life, and the dark turn it had taken. So, what do you think about this case? What could have been done differently? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Please like the video and subscribe for more true crime stories told with care and clarity. We'll see you in the next one. Thank you.